There we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, hello students and teachers. Welcome to the second online reading with Tom Franklin today. He's the author of the best-selling novel Crooked Letter, but I'm pretty sure you know that. My name is Sophia Kummler. I work for the d.a.i. Tübingen, and I will make sure that hopefully the event today runs smoothly and without any technical difficulties. The event today is hosted by the 4 German-American institutes in Baden-Württemberg, namely the d.a.i. Heidelberg, the Karl-Schurz-Haus Freiburg, the d.a.z. Stuttgart, and the d.a.i. Tübingen. And if someone has not heard of us yet, the d.a.i.s are independent cultural and educational institutions that have made it their mission to provide information about the USA and German-American relationships. For this purpose, each institute organizes various events which contributes to a better understanding of the ideals, values, and cultures of both countries. In addition, I would like to briefly draw your attention to our libraries, language courses, travel programs, and projects. And if you want, you can check them out on our websites or social media to see what's offered near you. Moreover, I'd like to point out that all 4 institutes offer various programs designed especially for you, teachers and students. You can find links to these programs below the YouTube video. And now, finally, to today's event. I'm very, very happy that despite the pandemic, we don't have to miss Tom Franklin's visit, even if it has turned out a little bit different this year. And since we received so many questions the last couple of days, we decided today to deactivate the chat for this session in order to just work through the already existing questions. And it is now with great pleasure that I introduce you to today's 2 main speakers. Firstly, of course, our guest of honor, so to say, Tom Franklin. And secondly, to our moderator, Ms. Inge Straß. She's the department head of the Seminar für Ausbildung und Fortbildung der Lehrkräfte Tübingen for English, and also teacher at the Wildermuth-Gymnasium in Tübingen. And I will hand it over to her now. Thank you both so much for being here today, and let's have fun.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Baden-Württemberg, and good morning, Mississippi. I'm Inge Straß, as Frau Kummler said, a teacher of English at Wildermuth-Gymnasium in Tübingen and also a teacher trainer at the Seminar Tübingen. And I have the pleasure to guide you through today's exciting event. We will hear Tom Franklin, who has joined us from his home in Oxford, Mississippi, although for him it's very early in the morning. He will talk about his novel, Crooked Letter, and also answer all these questions we've got. They've been submitted by some courses, some teachers, and lots of questions from yesterday's chat haven't been answered, so we will also try to address some of those. First, let me say a few words about our renowned guest, Tom Franklin, and set the stage for his reading. I take it that almost everybody, if not everybody, who's listening in has read and studied the novel Crooked Letter for the upcoming Abitur. And in doing so, you have probably also found out a little bit about the author. So I will not waste our precious time with lots of dates and facts and names and encyclopedic information. You probably know some of that already, or can easily look it up. But just a few things. Tom has been considered a regional writer covering the US South. He's also named a crime writer, but of course his fiction cannot be reduced to just crime writing. There's so much more in this novel, and he also writes other genres. For example, he's published a selection of short stories. Of the many prizes he was awarded, I will only mention the one that I like so much because of its name, the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger Award, and that was for Crooked Letter, as you might know. I'd rather talk about how I personally can relate to Tom Franklin, whom I met for the first time in December 2018 when he was touring Baden-Württemberg for the first time as the author of the Schwerpunktthema novel. And that event, of course, was also organized by the d.a.i. Then he read to a packed hall at the LTT in Tübingen, and you could actually feel how all the young students in the auditorium were hanging on his lips because he was so entertaining. This was much different. After the event, some of the organizers and some of the teachers were having lunch with him at the LTT cafeteria. We were also hanging on his lips because it was so interesting to listen. What was particularly memorable to me personally was how lovingly and admiringly he mentioned his wife a few times. And then he urged us to go to her poetry reading in the evening, which took place in a very special place. He said she was actually the better performer. That's why we should go. So of course I went. The venue was a very special and small place. It's the Hesse-Kabinett in Tübingen. It's a tiny museum where Hermann Hesse completed his apprenticeship to become a bookseller. And there was a very select audience at the time, less than 10 people, I think. But these 10 people were much rewarded for their effort of leaving their comfy homes on a winter night and go to this reading. Beth Ann Fennelly, Tom's wife, is a charming poet, and I was so impressed, I personally was so impressed that I bought not only one, but two of her books and had them signed by her. I'm not sure whether she's the better performer. It's just different. I really cannot decide, but certainly she matched her husband in lovingly mentioning him a few times during the event. So what's the aspect I can relate to best in Tom Franklin's life? Like him, I grew up in a small village where everybody knows everybody and where you have this strong sense of belonging because you know everybody. But that only is true if you fit in. Life can be very harsh and difficult if you don't fit in such a small place, if you're an outsider, if you're the outcast or the weirdo. So I do feel we have something in common there. Yet such similarities can be treacherous as well. In my case, the small village had a very homogeneous society. Only the pastor, the teacher, and the brewer were different, but they were still well respected. In Tom's village in southern Alabama, the setup of society wasn't like mine. It was half white and half black. So probably it was quite different to grow up there. I find it challenging to relate to this, but luckily there are books like Crooked Letter, which portray small town life in other places. In a place similar to the one Tom grew up in, and such books help me imagine what it might have been like. Still, there is this cultural gap. Sometimes when reading, we become aware of such gaps. Other times we lack awareness, which might lead to misreadings, misunderstandings, and so on. So becoming aware of such cultural differences and bridging the gaps in our understanding is the aim of an event like this, where we can talk to the author and ask him questions. So let's see the similarities, become aware of cultural gaps and differences, but also bridge them. I now would like to hand over to Tom Franklin, who I'm sure will enlighten us and will also entertain us. Tom, over to you now.
Thank you, Inge, and thank you, Sophia, too. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the German-American Institute for supporting me and this event. I wanted to show you the gold dagger. Here it is.
Okay, thank you.
I won this in London, and I tried to bring it back through security, and they would not let me. I had to send it home. They would not let me carry this on my carry-on, and I had no luggage, so I had to send it home. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and coming to see me. I'm really honored. I will talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then I want to answer your questions. I first want to apologize to you because I know that they are forcing you to read my book. You're made to read it, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm also very glad that you're reading it. It's really good for me, and I love my German connection. I love coming. I've come up there twice to talk to different audiences, and I'd be there speaking to you in person if not for this global pandemic, which hopefully we'll get past soon. And we have a new president in my country, and I'm very happy about that. I became very emotional as I watched the inauguration, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for 4 years of our last administration, whose name I will not say. But enough of that. Here we are. So you had to read Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. I'll just tell you a couple of things about the book, how it came about, how it came to be written. You might remember in the book the section where Larry and his father are driving and they pick up Alice and Silas. That is very autobiographical. That happened to me and my family, and I'll tell you about that. I grew up in Dickinson, Alabama, what I call a hamlet. It's not even a village, really. It's just the store and the houses around the store, and then 2 churches. There was the First Baptist Church, where white people went, and the Second Baptist Church, where Black people went. Churches were and still are mostly segregated in my country. So Dickinson was about 7 miles from, or 6 miles from Grove Hill, where my father, who was a mechanic, had an automotive repair shop, and where we went to school. We lived so far out that sometimes the school bus wouldn't pick us up, and my father drove us to school most mornings. I'm remembering a morning in January, maybe it's 1978 or 1979. And as we get into my father's pickup truck, it's my father, my sister, my brother, and me. So there are 4 people in the very small cab of this truck. And as we drove towards school, it was very cold that morning. We could see our breath. And as we headed towards school, we saw a woman and her daughter, a Black woman and her daughter, hitchhiking, trying to catch a ride. And because it was so cold, we gave them one. In those days, hitchhiking was very common and people helped other people. So we gave them a ride. And when they got into our truck, we were very, very crowded, very compacted. And what I remember is they smelled like wood smoke, smoke from a fire. And I realized that they only had a fireplace for their heat. Most houses then in Dickinson had gas heat, but not this. These people only had fire to heat them. So I understood how poor they were. So my father dropped them off in town and took us to school and dropped us off. And then he went on to work. Well, the next morning, the mother and daughter were there again. And the morning after that, and the morning after that. For 4 mornings in a row, we gave them rides. And then the 5th morning, they just weren't there, and we never saw them again. But obviously, they stuck in my memory. I remember still the smell of the wood smoke. You know, and smell is the sense most closely associated with memory. And sometimes now, if I build a fire in my fireplace in my house, right over there, I can remember that cab of my father's pickup truck that morning. So keep that image in your mind of us picking up those folks. You might even see already how I used that in Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. Another story, it might be the same year or maybe the year before. My mother was driving us home from school one day. She picked us up in the afternoon in her car and drove us home. We were headed home one afternoon, and as we drove home, again, very cold, we saw walking against traffic just a 2-lane road with trees on both sides, very rural. As we were driving home, we saw 2 Black children walking the other way, and they didn't have coats on. They were shivering as they walked, clutching themselves like this. Well, my mother pushed the accelerator down, drove home very fast, went into our house, into the back closet, and pulled out old coats of ours, one of mine for the little boy and one of my sister's for the little girl. These kids were probably 11 and 12 years old, very young. My mother took the coats back to them. And that also struck me, not just her kindness, but again, their poverty, to not even have something as essential as a coat. So again, you may see how that figured into Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. I wrote the novel mostly in Brazil. And as I wrote the novel in Brazil, it became more and more autobiographical, more and more about myself. And the character of Larry more and more resembled the person of Tommy Franklin. So I used those 2 parts of my own life. Our picking up that woman and her daughter, that became the first time that Larry and Silas meet in Crooked Letter, Crooked Letter. And then with the coats, I used that anecdote for Larry's mother dropping off the coats, giving the coats to Alice and Silas. So you see how a writer might use events from his own life to make his novel work. But in the novel, those events have deeper meaning. In my own life, they're just 2 things that I remember, just 2 stories that I can tell people. But in this novel, the events have much more significance. It's the first time that Larry meets Silas, who's his, as you know, spoiler alert, if you have not read the book, his half-brother. And with the coats, that's of course Larry's mother, Ina, confronting Silas's mother, Alice, and saying, I know that you're here, I know what's going on, and I don't approve of it. So those things have more meaning in the novel than they did in my life. Again, for me, just memories, stories. For Larry and Silas, main events in their lives. Another thing that Larry and I have in common is that we have very few friends in school. Larry and I have so much in common that it's easier to say what we don't have in common than what we do. What we don't have in common is that Larry has an abusive, mean, alcoholic father who does not like him, Carl Ott. And the other thing is that Larry has no siblings and no cousins, where as a kid, I had my brother, Jeff, a sister, and cousins. So I was not lonely at home as Larry is. And I had a very good father, unlike Larry. My father loved us. He did not drink, and he supported us. So those 2 things are what Larry and I do not have in common, but so many other things, the coats, and picking the folks up, all that's it's stuff that Larry and I do have alike. I love Stephen King, I still do, as Larry does. I had one Black friend, as Larry had with Silas. My friend was Wayne Coates. Wayne and I were nerds. It's kind of cool to be a nerd now, but it wasn't then. Being a nerd in those days where I lived could get you beaten up. And I was beaten up a lot by people at school. I had lots of bullies, a lot of bullies. And my friend Wayne, who, like Silas, was Black and I'm white, we were not allowed really. We did not feel at ease enough to sit together at lunch, for example. So at lunch, I would sit down from a group of white boys, and at another table, Wayne would sit down from a group of Black boys. And we never felt at ease enough to sit together for lunch. And that's something that I regret to this day. I wish I'd had the courage to take my lunch tray with my milk and my bad pizza and walk across and sit by Wayne. But in high school, you're so concerned with what other people are thinking. I understand this, and I was concerned with that myself. And I'll say to you, don't worry so much about what your classmates think. That won't matter in 5 years. What will matter in 5 years is how you acted in high school toward people who were perhaps less fortunate than you. But anyway, I'll tell you one more story and then I'll take your questions. As I said, I was not popular in school, but especially in high school. I didn't have any friends and certainly no girlfriend, but I was in love with a girl whose name was Carla. And she and I had a class together. I was in the 10th grade and so was she. We were in world history class and she sat all the way across the room. She was blonde and very pretty. I was short, skinny, and ugly. I looked like this, only younger, with no facial hair. And I'd had a crush on her for a long time. But she had a boyfriend. His name was Crazy Douglas, and he played American football, which meant he was very big. And again, I was tiny. He was probably twice as tall as I was. So that's the background. One day I was sitting in world history. I was drawing a comic book, as I always was, and they passed me a note. And I had never gotten a note passed to me since probably 2nd grade. And so I opened the note and it smelled, at least in my memory, like Carla's perfume. And the note said, "Want to go to the drive-in? Carla." I was surprised. I had heard that she and Crazy Douglas were having arguments, and maybe I thought they had finally broken up. So she wanted to go on a date with me. I thought, great. I wrote back, yes. And I handed her the note back. And we decided, yes, we go to the drive-in that Friday night. Well, that was great for me because the drive-in movie, I don't know if you have them in Germany. I don't think that you do. That's where you drive your car and you park outside and watch a movie screen outside. Actually, during the pandemic, drive-in movies have come back now in this country because it's safer to sit in your car and watch a movie outside than to be in a crowded theater. But in those days, drive-ins were quite common. So that's where we were going. And the drive-in showed rated R movies. And we couldn't see rated R movies, very often at home. And this, again, is 1978 in Alabama, 1979. And there wasn't much nudity in Alabama. If you were 15 or 16, you couldn't find it. There was no internet. There was no cable. The only nudity you could see was on the drive-in screen in the sky in Alabama at night. So, I love going to the drive-in to see rated R movies. But what I noticed too is in the big drive-in parking lot, far in the back, cars would park and their windows would get all foggy. And what those people were doing is they were making out in the car, right? And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make out at the drive-in with a girl. And so suddenly my dream is coming true. I'm driving to, I've got a date. And all week I anticipated the date. I watched every clock. Clocks moved so slowly. I thought Friday would never arrive for my date to the drive-in with Carla. My father was really proud of me, maybe for the first time, because I had a date. He said, "Take the good car, take the Toyota." My dad was a mechanic, and someone drove a Toyota through Grove Hill and stopped in his shop. He looked under the hood and he liked the engineering. So he went down south 2 hours to Mobile and bought one. But it was the only Toyota in our whole county. Nobody else had bought one at that point in 1978 or 1979. So I took the Toyota for my date. And I'd also told a couple of people about it. Maybe I bragged a little bit. So people knew that I had a date with Carla to the drive-in. And also I had a very recognizable car. Everyone in the county knew that Toyota because it was the only Toyota in Clark County, Alabama. One gas station owner refused to sell us gas for a Japanese car. He said, "I won't put any gas in a rice burner." Now, we found gas elsewhere. But anyway, so finally Friday arrived and finally it came time to pick Carla up. So I got in the Toyota and I drove to her house and I picked her up and we were headed to the movie just as Larry and Cindy were. And on the way, just as Cindy told Larry, Carla told me, I've got to go see my boyfriend. I got to go see somebody else. And I was disappointed because this was, my date. I'd even brought a blanket just in case we could make out, And I said, but our date, I want to, we're going to the drive-in. And she said, I've got to see Crazy Douglas tonight. She said, my parents will only let me date you. They knew my parents and they thought that I was a safe date for their daughter. And I was. Then she said, I'm going to have a little bitty baby. And I said, okay. I saw how serious it was. So I turned around and I took her to Crazy Douglas's and I dropped her off. She said, pick me up in 4 hours. And I said, okay. So I drove away with 4 hours to kill. I could not go home. I was embarrassed. My father would think, what? He had even given me $20, which was a lot of money in 1979. So as I was driving around wondering what to do, I shoved in an 8-track tape. I should back up and tell you, before iTunes and Apple Music, there were these things called CDs, compact discs, these antique devices that your parents may remember. Compact discs were round and you put them in your stereo and music came out. Before compact discs, there were cassette tapes, and that's how you played music in your car. Before cassette tapes, there were 8-track tapes. That's how old I am. So I pushed in the 8-track and it was the Eagles. The album was Hotel California. And I promise you, the song that came on was Victim of Love. And I was a victim of love as I drove alone on the dark streets of Alabama, the dark roads. And I finally decided I'll go to the drive-in by myself. I'll park close to the front. And I paid $5 to get in, which is not a bargain if you're by yourself. It's $5 per carload. And I parked way at the front thinking nobody will see me up here and I'll be safe. Because in high school, you really care what people think. And to be caught at the drive-in without a date would be very embarrassing. So I pulled close to the front and I sat there waiting for it to get dark. And finally, darkness began to fall and the previews began to show on the screen. And I looked at my rearview mirror and I saw a familiar green pickup truck pulling in behind me at the slot directly behind me. Well, I knew who that was. And I knew that if that person got out of his truck and came to my car, they would see I had no date. In fact, they could see through the windows that I had no date, through my back windshield. So what I did was I thought fast. I grabbed that blanket from the back seat and I put it over my hand like this, as if it were my date. So from the back, looking through my car, this would look like a girl's head, I thought. This had been my date for my whole life up until now. Tonight it really was. And I sat there with the blanket over my hand and watched the whole first movie. Nobody ever came to knock on my window, so I thought I got away with it. Sat there watching the movie. My arm got tired. I had to hold it up. And finally, the first movie ended and I drove away and didn't stay for the second feature and spent the next 2 hours just driving around. I picked up Carla 2 hours after that and I drove her home and she kissed me right on the cheek at her door and said, "Thank you, Tommy. You're a real good friend." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I drove home and I thought, that's it. That's the end of it. A couple of weeks later, I saw her in the cafeteria and I went up and said, "What about the little baby? What about the baby?" And she said, "Oh, it was a false alarm." And she walked off and I haven't ever seen her again, really. The cool thing for me now is that I'm here with you. Guess where she is? She's in prison for murder. After high school, she got married, not to Crazy Douglas, but to a different person. And she shot him in the back of the head. And she's spending the rest of her life in prison. I'm here with you, which is far better. But again, you see how for me, that's only an embarrassing story or a funny story. But for Larry, who took Cindy to the drive-in and had to drop her off, it's different. Cindy is never seen again and Larry is blamed. And because people saw Cindy's silhouette in the car, they think Larry's a liar when he said, I dropped her off. And you could understand it. So you see how writing a novel can come out of a writer's life, how that writer can change events and make them different to serve the story that the writer's trying to tell. I could talk a lot more, and I will, but I want to hear your questions. So I'll stop for now, and we'll take some questions.
Okay, well, thank you so far already. This has been very interesting to hear how you transform your own life into stories. There was a question here about how you actually go along writing your books. How did you develop the story? Did you think of the characters first and wondered what might happen to them? Or did the plot come to your mind first? Or was it still?
Yeah, a very good question. For me, I often start a short story or a novel with one or two ideas. In the case of Crooked Letter, I had two things in my mind, two things that stuck with me. You know, I told you a little bit about Dickinson, where I grew up. Dickinson, being so small, did not have its own police force. We had no cops, as we call them cops. We had no police, no local cops. So the nearest town to us is a place called Fulton. My father's shop was in Grove Hill, 6 miles away. Fulton was 2 miles away in a different direction. Fulton had one police officer. His name was Larry Hicks. And Fulton had one police car, and Larry drove that car everywhere. He drove it home at night, and he drove it around. And his jurisdiction was Fulton, his own little town, but also Dickinson, because it was so close. So twice a day he drove through Dickinson just to make sure everything was okay. And I was always interested in that, the idea of a small town police officer. There are so many crime novels and movies and TV shows about detectives and police officers in cities. There are far fewer about rural police officers. So I was very interested in like a one-man police force. That was one thing I was thinking about and wanted to write about for Crooked Letter. The other was a mechanic with no customers. My own father's mechanic shop was always very full. He had a good reputation and always had lots of business. He was always busy. 1 mile south on Highway 43 in Grove Hill was my uncle's automotive repair shop. My Uncle Edward had his own shop called Gates Automotive, and he never had customers. 2 or 3 times, I worked for my father after school and during the summers, and my father would often send me south to go to the house where I would buy auto parts, the parts house. And I would pass my uncle's automotive repair shop on the way to pick up parts, and I would notice no customers. He never had customers. On the drive back, no customers. And and my Uncle Edward is long dead now. My father is dead too, but my father's shop is still there. Someone else owns it. But my Uncle Edward's son, my cousin Robbie, now owns that shop. And I guarantee you, Robbie is arriving at work right about now. He's just pulling into his shop in Grove Hill, Alabama, in his pickup truck. It's red, a red Ford, and he will have no customers all day. He still doesn't. So for some reason, the idea of a mechanic with no customers fascinated me. It hooked my imagination. So for me, the first 2 things that led to Crooked Letter were small town police officer and mechanic with no customers. I was also interested in the idea of brothers. My brother Jeff is 2 years younger than I am, and he now owns my father's garage. He works in there, but it's now in Mobile in a different spot, and it's also very successful. Jeff, 2 years younger than I, as I said, but we're very different. He's conservative, I'm liberal. He voted for what's his name twice. I did not vote for what's his name twice. Jeff hunts and fishes. I don't hunt anymore, but I still fish. Jeff has mechanic's hands. His hands have scars and the whorls in his fingernails, or his fingerprints, excuse me, have grease in them. My wife says he has really sexy hands, his mechanic hands. I have writer's hands. They're not very sexy, as you see, not sexy at all. But I was thinking of my brother and how close we are despite our vast differences, but also the mechanic with no customers and a small town police officer. All these things were in my head about the book I wanted to write. It didn't even have a title then. And I had it set in Alabama. But a friend of mine visited. His name is David Wright, and he visited, and we sat right out here on our patio. He's a writer too, and we were talking about our books. And I was saying, I was trying to write a book about a small town cop and a mechanic with no customers who were brothers, but I couldn't make it work. And my friend David Wright said, make the cop a black guy. I thought, wow, what a good idea. That would never have occurred to me. I would not have felt good about appropriating a black man's voice and writing from my own white point of view. And I said this to David. I said I would be nervous doing that. He said, yeah, it might be very challenging for you, but when you're finished with it, I will read it for you and I'll help you. So I said, okay. And I began to write Silas as an African-American man. And I tried to think how African-Americans have a different life than white Americans in my country. And I remembered a conversation I'd had with David a couple of years before. David and his wife, they're both black. They had a maid who was white. And they recommended that their maid, their housekeeper, to my wife and me. And so she came and became our housekeeper as well for a few months. And David and I were talking one night, and he said to me, will she do your toilets? I said, yeah, she cleans our toilets. Why? He said, she will not clean our toilets. And I thought about that. And I ultimately realized that, you know, in my country, a white person can go their whole life and not really think about race or race relations. But African Americans in my country are confronted with racism every day. Every day something happens. So that's how I began to try to write, you know, from a different perspective. And when I finally got a first draft of it written, I sent it to David, and he read it quickly and called me, and he told me all the times I got the words wrong, the words for being black. He said she would not think, for example, Silas's mother would not think of herself as black. She would think of herself as being colored because she's of an older generation, and that's how the older generation thought. And, you know, the N word is in the book a few times. And David told me where it was accurate and where it was not accurate. For me, it was a very tense conversation. I was sweating. He really helped me out. And I thank him in the back of the books in the acknowledgements page. So a very long answer to where the book came from. That's really where it started.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Since you were talking about Silas so much, now I'd like to switch to, you know, let's talk about the characters and Silas, especially when you had to, move the novel. You said you moved it from Alabama to Mississippi. There were probably quite a few changes, and these changes obviously were very strong for Silas himself. At the beginning, initially he was portrayed as a blameless man, wasn't he? And in the end, he's just a human being with faults. What do you think Silas's character expresses as a whole, and what does he stand for? That was the question that was asked here.
Well, I don't know. I do know. When I'm writing these characters, I'm not thinking of what they stand for. I'm not thinking of them symbolically or allegorically or anything else. I'm only thinking of them as characters, or even more specifically as people. They first have to operate and function as people before they can be anything else. So I've got to make them accurate. I've got to make them believable. And so hopefully they're both believable. You know, and I've heard people talk about good characters and bad characters, good people and bad people. I don't see the world in terms of good and bad, good and evil, black and white. I know that the real world is all a big gray area. And I don't see, you know, Larry as the hero and Silas as the villain, or Silas as the hero and Larry as the villain, or even Wallace as the villain. I just see them as people. We don't say, you know, I teach creative writing at the University of Mississippi. And, you know, and for years, we have not said the story's hero or the story's villain. We now say the story's protagonist and the story's antagonist. The protagonist is simply the person with whom you are aligned as the reader. You know, because often our character now in contemporary literature or contemporary film, the character is the bad guy. You know, there's a whole HBO show called The Sopranos that some of you may have seen and probably know about. Our protagonist, the guy we follow, is Tony Soprano, who's a horrible person. He kills people. He cheats on his wife. There's nothing redeeming about him. He's a terrible human being, and yet we're fascinated by him. And we're in his head. You know, we're with him. We see what he does, and we root for him sometimes. But he's not a hero. He's way more of a villain, but we're aligned with him. So we have the word protagonist to make it easier to understand and root for somebody who's not so wholesome, perhaps. And the antagonist might be a good person. The antagonists are often police officers in crime fiction. And they're simply the person, you know, a protagonist wants something. That this person wants something, the protagonist wants something, the antagonist is in the way. So when I'm asked what Silas stands for, I'm not sure what to say, except that I hope he is a believable person on the page. And certainly he is flawed. He's very flawed. In fact, he helps to cause Larry's life to be so terrible. Silas's action first and later his inaction really affects Larry's life. And so Silas does an awful thing. And to me, that helps make him human. Without that, he might be, you know, just too good of a character, handsome, charismatic, smart, introspective, with an admirable job that he does well. So he would otherwise be maybe too good of a character. So I needed to give him a flaw, something that would bring him down to earth. And Larry, on the other, what does Larry stand for? Well, you know, Larry, the story I argue has two protagonists. They're both protagonists. You know, it's the story of these two men and their lives. And, you know, a novel can have two protagonists. A short story needs one. But Larry is also flawed, perhaps through no fault of his own, but Larry does have flaws, obviously. But Larry runs the danger of being a victim. And when a character is a victim, you take away their agency. And one feels pity for a victim. And pity is a good emotion, but pity brings with it condescension. So you can't but look down on someone you pity a little bit, even if you're trying not to. So, you know, again, back to the question, what do they stand for? I hope they stand for themselves and are just people who are representative of who real people might be.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. What about their friendship then? I mean, it's not just a friendship, they're also half brothers. Is it a proper friendship at the beginning? And will there be a proper friendship between them after their reconciliation? Or is maybe Silas just, you know, reconciling with him to clear his conscience?
Good question, thank you. I think their friendship when they're young is in no way a proper friendship. I'm not sure what a proper friendship is, except that I think that it means that both friends give equally.
Mhm.
In this case, I feel that Larry is so lonely that he would have been friends with anybody. And I think that Silas himself is needy right then. Silas has just moved to town and doesn't have anything. And so when he meets Larry, Larry gives him the rifle, and Silas has something that he can hold on to and that can become his own. I think that there's probably some jealousy on both sides. I think Silas is jealous of Larry having a father and being established. And I think that Larry is jealous of Silas because obviously Larry's father admires Silas more than Larry. And Silas, the more he is in the area, gets on the baseball team and has friends and becomes popular, where Larry has none of that. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the friendship was proper at the beginning. I think it was a friendship of convenience for both. I think Larry certainly fell harder, in the way that a friendship can be an infatuation. Early on, Larry fell harder. And I think Silas may have used Larry a little bit. And in no way do I judge Larry for falling hard or Silas for using him. I think both of those boys were getting by the best way they could with what they had. As adults, it's a different story. I feel that Larry was reaching out to Silas when he heard Silas was back in genuine friendship. He wanted to contact him. And he doesn't know that Silas had seen Cindy, that Silas has information that would be key to Larry's life. Larry's only reaching out because he heard his friend came back. And Silas spurns that. And there's Silas's big flaw. Mm-hmm. I can't blame Silas for leaving when he did as a high schooler, because he might have been in real danger where he was and when he was. I don't blame him for leaving. Where blame can be placed on Silas is that when he comes back 20 years later and when he sees what's happened, then he could have said something, but he didn't. Out of embarrassment, out of shame, whatever. And I could understand embarrassment and I could understand shame. But to have injured another person like that, to me, is nearly unforgivable. And the fact that Silas only confesses when he's confronted with it makes it further unforgivable to me. So Silas really does an awful thing and lets it linger. So, the second part of this question is, after reconciliation, what will happen? Well, that's after the novel. That's after the last page 301. But as the person who wrote this book, as the person who made up these characters, I can offer a pretty good guess. I can guess that later, after reconciliation, they will go fishing together. They will eventually become friends. In fact, they will eventually become brothers because they need each other. They're each other's only family. And family is so important to human beings. So I think that's what I'll say about that one.
Good. As the person who wrote these characters, I have another question here. There were lots and lots of questions about Cindy. What made you decide not to confirm Cindy's fate until the very end? And of course, our students are interested in what will actually happen to her, or will you reveal what actually happened to Cindy?
Yes. Well, I'll say this. Novels try to represent real life, or anyway, realistic novels try to represent real life. And I wanted my novel to be realistic, for Silas and Larry to feel like real people, and for the novel to be believable. And the thing about real life is it doesn't give us all the answers. There are things we never find out. And, as humans, we try to ascribe meaning to the events that happen to us. Why did my father die? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did I get this illness? I've been good my whole life. A friend of mine, his brother died, and that his brother had been a Christian. He'd done everything right. And he said, Why am I terminally ill? You know, and there are no real answers for that. You know, we seek answers in religion or philosophy or art, but there just aren't any answers. We can't know some things. And in my trying to make my novel Crooked Letter as realistic as possible, I thought I will not reveal what happened to Cindy, because if the characters don't know, then why should the readers know? So I tried to make the novel realistic, and that's why I did that. But also, the same way I can know that Larry and Silas will eventually become brothers, I can tell you what really happened to Cindy Walker. It's not that her stepfather Cecil strangled her and buried her in an old well that he knew about way back in the woods. That didn't happen. What really happened is she snuck away. She hitchhiked. It was safer back then. She got a ride. She went down to the port in Mobile and somehow got on a ship. I think she stowed away, and she went south and wound up in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. And there she met an older woman who owned an art gallery. And she fell in love with this older woman. And they got married. And then Cindy becomes an artist, and she makes collages. And they're very happy, the two of them. That's what happened.
Yeah, that's a nice story. Maybe a little sentimental. Let's go on and discuss some of the themes that are interesting in your book. And of course, the theme that is most interesting for our students is the ambiguity of belonging. How do you define this, and what does belonging and loneliness mean to you?
Yeah. Well, to belong to a place, you know, I mean, I don't know if this is where the word comes from, but, you know, to be someplace long, to be part of a place, and to feel at ease there. To belong means you're accepted and you accept. That's to belong somewhere, you know. So I belong to my family, and I belong to, as my daughter calls it, different friend groups. You know, so we belong to places where other humans exist. And so it seems to me that to not belong would be a particularly onerous existence. And I felt growing up as if I did not belong in Dickinson. I grew up feeling like a misfit, as I think a lot of writers, probably a lot of humans grow up feeling like, I don't belong here. Everyone in Dickinson, or well, I should say, all the boys where I grew up hunted. They loved to shoot and kill animals. And I didn't like to do that. I didn't like to kill anything, but I also didn't like to wake up early in the morning and go out where it was cold. I did not enjoy hunting. And that way I was different from 95% of the boys in my demographic. I also didn't like football. And, you know, everyone, my whole family is obsessed with Alabama football. This is American football, not soccer. I didn't care about football. So I wasn't into hunting or sports. I also wasn't into religion. My family was very big into religion. So in those three ways, I felt like an outcast. And I pretended to like hunting, and I hunted, and I pretended to like religion, and I went to church, and so on. And I pretended to like football, but I didn't. But I think by pretending, by watching how everyone else acted, by listening to how they talked, I learned to fit in. And I think this is how I became a writer, by watching other people so closely. And I can give you an example. You know, when we mimic speech in fiction, it's called dialogue. You know, and we want to make our dialogue as believable as possible. And dialogue in a novel or a short story, dialogue in fiction is not real speech, of course. It's the illusion of it. But we want the illusion to be a very real one. So we try to make our speech sound like real people, our dialogue sound like real people. When I was growing up, I read lots of books. That was another way I was different. No one really in my family except my mother read. I read constantly. And what I noticed in books is that the correct way to say the following line was this. Jeff and I are going hunting. But everyone in Dickinson would say, me and Jeff are going. Me and Jeff, me and Jeff, me and Inge, me and Sophia. You know, we do it like that. Just say it incorrectly, grammatically incorrectly. I said it like that, even though I knew I shouldn't have. So in a way, I spoke the local language and paid attention to dialogue. So this is, I think, one way that I became a writer, by not belonging to that place. And I think that, like me, Larry does not belong to the family in which he's born, and is not allowed to belong to the community in which he lives because of his own. Well, you know, it's implied, I think, that Larry's parents had to get married, that she was pregnant before they got married, and that's why they were married. And Carl never loved his wife. And then when they had this kid who he felt trapped by and who looked like his wife, Carl never loved, in fact, may have hated his own child. So Larry does not feel as though he belongs to his own family and in his own community, even though he was born there. So he should belong there. On the flip side of the coin is Silas, who when he arrives in this place in Mississippi, does not belong there because he's not from there. And yet he fairly quickly becomes popular. He joins the baseball team. He gets a girlfriend, even though she's a secret. And he has friends, Eminem, who is his second baseman, and Silas is the shortstop. So even though he doesn't belong there, it seems as though he does. So I think perhaps that's why this book is chosen, because the character who should belong doesn't, and the character who should not belong does, which I think defines the ambiguity of belonging.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was nicely put. And as you said, all the examples you mentioned were really examples for boys. So sort of masculinity must be a topic in the book as well. And you talked about hunting, for example, and of course for hunting you need guns. So maybe we could get to the topic of gun control here. What role do guns play, and what's your personal idea about guns, your personal opinion? Should there be strict gun control? Even though guns are part of the culture and give such a strong feeling of belonging, obviously, to the boys here. They also had to fight about the gun and so on.
That's true. I think the gun is first in the novel just a gun. You know, it works as a rifle. It functions that way, but it does absolutely take on the weight of symbol by the end of the novel. Guns are a symbol. They can't not be, of masculinity. You know, they're an extension of the penis, and men have guns more than women. You know, in my country, it's true. If a woman has a gun, it's often a smaller gun, often a handgun. And certainly, you know, when I make a generalization like this, there are plenty of exceptions, and I really try not to make generalizations. But at least in the American South, more men hunt than women. Typically, the men hunt and the women stay home. That's how it is in all my family's situations. The men hunt, the women stay at home. Sometimes women hunt, but it's really unusual. Sometimes women have guns, but it's more unusual. So, you know, this question has a couple of sections. Let's talk about Larry first. And the rifle that he has is it's a small caliber rifle with no recoil. It doesn't kick when you shoot it, and it doesn't make a lot of noise. So I've shot just hundreds and hundreds of guns, hundreds of times. Well, probably dozens of guns, hundreds of times. What I never liked, when we shot, we never used hearing protection. So one of my ear, this ear, I shoot left-handed. This ear is damaged permanently from shooting so many guns because we never used hearing protection. And I hated the loud noise, and I hated the kick that a gun had. So I never enjoyed shooting. And when I shoot, my barrel shakes. And so I miss my target. I'm a terrible shot. And Larry's like me. The gun that Larry's carrying is this small caliber 22 rifle with no kick and very little noise. So it's not the most masculine gun. It's not a big fat shotgun or a high caliber. It's not a 30-30 rifle or a 30-06 rifle or, you know, a 406 or a 302. It's a small rifle. And I think that way it connects to Larry. You know, and you know, it also is emblematic of Larry's loneliness, because Silas wants the gun and Larry wants a friend. He blurts out, "Here, you take it," knowing that he's doing a thing that's going to make his father very angry if his father ever finds out. So that's just an example of how desperately lonely Larry is. It's also an example of Silas taking advantage. I don't blame Silas for taking the gun. I would too if I were Silas. But it's him taking advantage, especially when he won't give it back. His not giving it back really causes Larry trouble. And also, Carl Ott says, Larry's father says that a man's job is to give his son a gun, and a boy gets a gun from his father. Silas has no father, but he still gets a gun, which is actually a gun that belongs to his real father, but he doesn't know it. So Carl does know that Silas is his kid. And that's why Carl allows Silas to keep the rifle after he makes the boys fight. He knew when he made them fight, Silas would win. And that was his way of giving his other son a rifle, fulfilling that fatherly duty. Yeah. As to gun control, I absolutely believe in gun control. One of our former presidents, who I really admire, Jimmy Carter, wrote an opinion for, I think, the New York Times. And what he said is, "I have several guns. I was a peanut farmer. Guns are tools." He says, I have shotguns, which I use to shoot doves, birds, and that's just, a shotgun doesn't shoot very far. It shoots pellets and they spray out in an array. Rifles shoot a single cartridge, a bullet rather. Gosh, hang on.
Well,
So Jimmy Carter said, I have a shotgun for dove hunting, and I have rifles, 30-06 for deer hunting. He said, I don't need any gun bigger than that. I do not need anything automatic. You don't need those in our country. Those are strictly for war, and that kind of thing. So what I think is absolutely, I believe in gun control. I think they should be licensed. I think we only need rifles and shotguns. We don't need any kind of repeating automatic weapons. That's silly. Although I have friends, and I have relatives who have these repeating automatic weapons. And I will say to you that I have 2 firearms myself. I have a beautiful old double-barrel shotgun from my grandfather, which I will give to my son as an heirloom. I don't shoot it anymore. I have 1 shell for it, but I don't shoot it but it's a beautiful piece of history from my family. And and farmers, ranchers used them as tools. You would have to shoot a coyote if it were eating some of your livestock, say. So gun control is something that I'm very strongly in favor of. And in my family, I'm very much the minority.
Thank you. I learned so much about guns now. It's incredible. You explained it really nicely how they differ and so on. Yeah, well, in your novel, the black boy is given a gun, and that certainly was a little unusual, I suppose. So let's turn to the topic of racism. In which way does it play a role in your novel? Do you think your novel can help address the important aspect of racism and how to deal with it, especially nowadays in times of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I hope so. This is certainly, I think, the biggest challenge, our country has faced since its inception. I mean, I know Corona is raging right now, but still, Corona is raging heavier and harder in Black and brown communities than in white communities because of systemic racism in my country. So I hope that Crooked Letter can help address racism. And one thing I'm so thankful for is, my friend David Wright recommending that I make Silas African-American, because if I hadn't, it would have simply been another crime book about two white men. And it probably would have been forgotten a lot more quickly. But once I pushed it into this international discussion of the treatment of people because of how they look, the book, I think, became a different kind of book. It became a book about something more. It would have been about crime. It would have been about family and abuse and loneliness and the ambiguity of belonging. But it would not have been about race relations, which is a very important topic in our country and obviously becoming more and more important. And I'll tell you exactly what has brought this Black Lives Matter to the front are these things. For the first time, Black people have always known how the cops treated them, but white people were blissfully ignorant of that. White people either knew and turned the other cheek or did not know. Black people have always known. And so finally, when there's recorded evidence, do people say, oh my God, that really happens, doesn't it? So that's what's changed. And hopefully what I can do is just tell a story and try to put a reader in someone else's shoes. George R.R. Martin, the writer of Game of Thrones, the novels, says that, a reader lives 1,000 lives. A non-reader lives one life. And if you live 1,000 lives, you begin to educate your emotions. You begin to learn empathy, especially if you're reading books about different kinds of people different from you. I spent a couple of years ago, I spent the whole year reading no straight white males, anything but what I am. Try to get other opinions, see the world through other perspectives, wear different shoes. And so hopefully by, showing people that Larry and Silas have so much in common despite being so different, people might see, yeah, okay, I shouldn't think this way. And also they might think, maybe there's someone, in your life out there, students and teachers, who, is someone and you've heard something about them. They're a pariah, they're unpopular. Maybe they're really a scary Larry. Maybe there's somebody who that's not true about. Maybe there's someone who you could at lunch pick up your tray and go over and sit by the person who's sitting by himself, by herself. So hopefully this book will make one person lift up their tray and cross the cafeteria and sit with somebody who's different from them.
Is this why you once said that the novel is about healing? That could be one of the answers here, couldn't it?
Yes.
Are there other authors would you like to read? Any literary models? I mean, you've told us now that you were trying to read non-white men, so I suppose you read colored women.
Yeah, I did. I read Zadie Smith.
Can you recommend us something else to read? So maybe that's your chance now to recommend colleagues. Yes,
let me recommend 3 different African-American women. I want to recommend Tayari Jones, Tayari Jones. Tayari Jones wrote an amazing novel called An American Marriage. And this novel was picked up by the Oprah Book Club. So it's been very popular and done very well. And I think it's sold for film as well. It's about an African-American couple, and they're married, and the man is accused of something, and he's falsely accused. His wife knows he's falsely accused, but he's sent to prison anyway. And it's about how their marriage survives that, or does it survive that? And it's a book that I wish, the ex-president had read, to see how people other than rich white people are treated. The second novel I'd recommend is called Homegoing. One word, Homegoing. This writer's name, I don't have the book here, is strange. She is from Africa, but raised in Huntsville, Alabama. Her name is Ya, spelled Y-A-A. Her last name is Jessie, which is spelled G, I think it's apostrophe H-A-S-I. G-H-A-S-I, it is an apostrophe, but I forget where that is. Ya, Jessie. Homegoing is it's literally an incredible novel because it starts in the 1700s on the Gold Coast of Africa. It starts with two half-sisters who don't know they're half-sisters. One is raised in the castle as royalty, and they're both African. They're both Black. They're not African-American. They're both African. One is raised in the castle as royalty, and the other is raised in the dungeon as a slave. And the slave sister is sent across the ocean to America and endures slavery. And the other sister from the castle lives a much more privileged life. And that is chapter 1 is the privileged sister. Chapter 2 is the sister in the dungeon. Chapter 3 goes back to the privileged sister, but it's the next generation. The novel, every chapter progresses generationally. So by the end of the novel, we're in contemporary times. So it spans 3 centuries and several generations of this one family, how they're split up, and they don't even know their what their family lines are. In that way, the novel is incredible. Mm-hmm. I recommend it with all my heart. Mm. And Ya was at the American Academy, I think in 2018 in Berlin. So I imagine there's a good German translation, but some of you guys, I know many of you read English so well, you can find it in her original English. And the third book I was going to recommend, it's going out of my, just White Teeth from Zadie Smith, Z-A-D-I-E, or any other books of hers. I'm reading her collection of stories right now called Grand Union. But I've fallen in love with Zadie Smith's writing in the last, I actually read her in Berlin for the first time in 2016. But so I'd recommend those 3 with all my heart.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, although you recommended other books now, I'd like to get back to your own novel, Crooked Letter. And there was an interesting question here. To what extent is the scenery important or even decisive in the novel's plot? It's described so much throughout the novel. There are detailed descriptions, so there must be some function and some importance.
Yeah, I think some people may have thought there was too much nature description. I've read some reviews that said too much nature description. For a while, I would do the stupid thing of going on Amazon.com and reading reviews of the novel. And some of them really hurt my feelings. And for some of them, I tried to write angry responses. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But I never sent them. I just have to ignore that. And I finally stopped reading those altogether. But for someone who writes about the South, you can't escape, like you can't escape race relations, you can't escape landscape. In all my books, landscape, I hope, is as important as the characters are. I want the landscape to be its own character, even its own, to have its own, to be its own character, I guess is how I'll say that. So scenery for me has always been really, really important. And I've always enjoyed describing the way the vines interlock and how spider webs look and the way the sky looks. I'm really crazy about nature and the outdoors, and I love catching snakes and lizards and frogs. I don't kill anything anymore. I kill wasps, mosquitoes, and ants if they're inside, but otherwise I don't kill things. But for me, scenery is key. And as I say, the South has so much of it that is rural, you know, and for someone who likes to write crime novels sometimes, it's great because terrible things happen in wide open spaces. The farther you are from other people, the more insane you can become, and the crazier things you can do, and the more places there are to hide a body. You can get away with stuff a lot easier in the South. And the South also is full of guns, so it's a dangerous place, and it's a good place to write about crime. And I just love the names of natural things. I love the names of trees and bushes and animals, flora, fauna. You know, I love the names of fish. I've got a whole shelf of books over there that are nature books so that I can get my nature right. The book I'm trying to write now has a panther in it, which is like a large cat, like a mountain lion, but it's black, you know, a black panther. And so, you know, I've been reading a lot about them and trying to get them right. So yeah, nature to me, landscape, scenery is very important. And I hope that it continues to be important.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about this vine, this special vine, Kudzu, I think it's called.
Yeah.
That seems to play a particularly important role.
Kudzu is an invasive vine that was brought over from Southeast Asia for the 1921 World Fair, maybe. I forget the year. It's brought over for an early World Fair to my country. Because it grows rapidly, it was brought over to curb erosion. And it was planted beside highways in the South to try to stop the soil from being washed away. Well, what they did not bring with it were the tiny bugs, the parasites that eat it. Without those parasites that are in Japan and Vietnam and other places, this vine can go crazy. And what it's done in the American South, it has gone crazy. You can drive down the interstates, and all you will see is kudzu. It covers the trees. They're like mummies. You can't see the shape of the tree, or you can't see the details of the tree. You see its shape. It goes across power wires like lace. It covers signs. If you stood there long enough as a person, it would cover you up. You can almost see it move. If you look at it and look away and look back, it's grown that much. They call it mile-a-minute vine because it grows so fast and covers everything. And there's a line in Crooked Letter that says the land has a way of covering the wrongs of the people. I'm thinking of kudzu, which just moves so fast and covers things. And it's a vine. I kind of love it. It's beautiful in a way, but it's also toxic because it kills whatever it climbs on. The trees that it's encompassing, it's killing them. It's keeping the light from them. And as a parasite, it's nurturing itself from them. So it's not a good vine, but to me, it's emblematic of the South because we often do things that are contrary to our own benefit. You know, we shoot ourselves in the foot, so to speak. And I think bringing that vine over without testing it properly is a good example of how we can really screw ourselves in the South by not thinking very much.
Thank you. I've got a few questions. Maybe they have short answers. Maybe there is not much of an answer. One of them is, now I've lost it. Oh yeah, the TV channels. Is there a deeper meaning behind the number of TV channels?
Well, yeah. Again, everything in a novel is a writer's choice. And what Larry has 3 channels. You know, when I was growing up, there was no cable. What you had, you know, everything was broadcast through the airwaves. And us living so far in the country, we only had 3 channels that are long. We had an antenna, which was taller than the house, a big metal thing with, metal forks that pulled in these television waves. And we had an ABC channel and an NBC channel and a CBS channel. And they started at 6 in the morning and they signed off at midnight. So from midnight to 6, there was nothing on TV. And they were clear sometimes. We had to go turn the antenna to get them clear. And so this novel, I think, is set, I forget the year it's set, but Larry still has an antenna and he has only the 3 channels. Larry, some of these rural areas in Alabama, Mississippi are not able to get good internet now because they're so rural. And that was in my childhood, we only got 3 channels versus other places which had more channels. We didn't have a public broadcasting system channel, a PBS channel. We didn't even have that. So Larry is, he's a pariah. He's trapped. He stays at home and he drives to work and back and maybe to a fast food place. He really is trapped on his own property. And so those 3 channels are emblematic of how little information he gets, because by then he could have had direct TV or cable. But he just doesn't think that it doesn't occur to him to get it. He doesn't think he could get that. And so he doesn't. And so at the end, Silas has had him signed up for cable. So it's just another way of maybe bringing the world more to Larry. He will get more information, I think.
What connects the title with the novel? These are the questions.
The title, Crooked Letter, of course, literally means it's how children are taught to spell Mississippi. M-I, crooked letter I, crooked letter I, humpback I. Humpbacks are P's, crooked letters are S's. So I called the book that first because I loved the title, and no other book or movie had been called that. And I thought it's a great title. It has the word crooked in there, so it felt like a crime novel to me. A crook is a criminal, crooked. Nixon, one of our other infamous presidents would always say, "I'm not a crook." So crook and crooked is a word I really loved. But also, so I chose it because I liked it. Because I chose it, I had to move the book from Alabama to Mississippi because it's obviously a Mississippi title. So it's a Mississippi title and it's a crime title, I felt. But once I decided to call it that, I began to look for other meanings for the title because the title should have direct connections to its work. And so crooked letters are S's, and there's 2 S's in Silas's name. Crooked letter S's are what the noise that a snake makes. S, 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 S. Crooked letters are snake-shaped. And the novel's filled with snakes. Wallace Stringfellow puts a snake in his ex-girlfriend's mailbox. And I think Larry likes to catch snakes too. Also, M-I, crooked letter I, is a mnemonic device. M-N-E-O-N-I-C, a teaching device. And it's a device to teach children how to spell Mississippi. But also something that's taught is racism. People are not born racists. They're educated into being racist, right? So it's also about how we educate our children into things, including racism. So I'd like to think that the title has many different meanings, other than just what I hope is a catchy, cool title.
Okay, next quick question. What about alcohol in the novel? What's the role of alcohol? Both fathers drink. Cindy's and Larry's are heavy alcoholics.
Yeah, there's a lot of alcoholism in the American South. A lot of counties. When I grew up, my county was dry, which meant alcohol sales were prohibited in that county. But at every road out of the county, right across the county line, were beer joints, places to go and buy beer. So I was not educated in an alcoholic family. My parents were teetotalers, which meant that they never drank. They were churchgoers instead. But I had an uncle who was an alcoholic and an aunt who was an alcoholic, and I saw the damages that it did. I had friends whose parents were just terrible. You know, one set of friends, you know, their father drank all the time, and I watched him beat them physically many times as a kid. So, you know, alcohol abused ruins families. And in this novel, I think Carl's probably an alcoholic. I know Cecil is. And it's just one other way that unhappy people cope. And when unhappy people use alcohol to cope, it exacerbates. It makes their situation even worse. And I think that Carl drank so much in the novel because he's so unhappy. He's in an unhappy marriage, doesn't like his wife or his son. Carl is happiest, you may notice, when he's at his shop, fixing cars and telling stories to a group of people like him. And we see there that he has great charisma. And there's even a really sad moment in the novel where before Larry's date, Carl tells a funny story. And for a moment around their table, they act like a real family and laugh about things. That's because Carl thinks Larry has a date and he's kind of proud of him for a moment. But of course that ends quickly, and that's their only happy moment. And they're also their last happy moment. Mm-hmm. So alcohol, unfortunately, plays a large role in most of my writing because most of my characters are the type who would abuse alcohol. And I've been known to abuse it myself, but I try to use it carefully.
What about mental health? To what extent is mental health a central aspect in the novel? If you consider the condition of Larry Art and Ina Art and also Wallace Stringfellow.
Well, to them, mental health would not really even be an issue. They wouldn't have thought much about mental health. No one in this novel would ever go to see a counselor or a psychiatrist. It just wouldn't occur to them. To them, they just have to exist the way they exist, and alcohol would be a way to self-medicate. So their mental health, I would say, is not healthy. They do not have good mental health because they don't talk about things. One thing that talking to a counselor does is lets you get things out, lets you air things, and you're able to articulate or try to articulate, or you talk and the counselor helps you articulate what's wrong. You know, if I'm feeling something, if I can identify it, if I can say, oh, I'm feeling pensive because I'm nervous about what's happening, I can understand my feelings better and deal with them better. If something has a name, you begin to own it a little bit. So if you're diagnosed with having dyslexia, you understand why you have trouble reading because of this reason. There's a reason for it, a mental reason for it. But unfortunately, the characters that I write about would not do this. I have an aunt who's very much alive, but she brain tumors run in my family. And my grandmother had one the size of a grapefruit in her head, but it was benign and it was removed and she was healthy for 20 more years. My aunt had one the size of a baseball and she had it removed. And she, for 10 years, as her brain tumor grew, her behavior slightly changed. And we didn't know why she was getting mean. She would tell you what she really thought. She would say, your hair is ugly. Your breath stinks. She had always been really sweet, but her personality was changing. And we didn't know why. And it never occurred to us that she might have been sick. And somebody finally said, she needs to go to a psychiatrist. And so she tried it. None of us had ever done that. None of us would have thought to do that. The first thing the psychiatrist asked her after hearing about her symptoms was, is there a history of brain tumors in your family? Because this sounds like you might have one. She's, well, yes, she said, my mother had one. Well, let's get you a CAT scan. And they did, and they found it the size of a lemon, and they removed it. And she had not been able to smell for a couple of years. And she hadn't been able to cry for 3 years. When they removed it, she could smell again. And she cried for almost a week. And she remembered how she had insulted everybody and tried to make amends. But again, the point of that whole story is we wouldn't have thought about mental health, which in this case, she finally did seek mental help. And it cured her by saying, there's something wrong with you.
Thank you so much. I think we've learned so much about, you know, the characters of the book, but also the topics, and you gave us some insight in your own private family. And I also have a feeling that a part of this was like a creative writing course. So this has been a great afternoon. My final question is, will there be a sequel?
There will be, and it's called Humpback, Humpback.
Wow. Okay. We're all
that's a
looking
joke.
forward to that.
That's a joke. I kind of considered a sequel for a while, but the main character would have been Roy French. He's Silas's, the other cop. He's the chief investigator for the county. And he's a character based on a friend of mine named Sid French, who I really, he's dead now, who I really love. He died when I was in Berlin in 2016. But I've got a good plot about him. Okay. So if I do, Scary Larry and Silas will make cameos.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much for all the insights you gave us.
Thank you. And to all you students, thank you so much for reading the book. Again, I'm sorry you were made to read it, but I'm thankful that you read it. And I hope you'll keep reading books. And I hope that from this book, you will take the idea of kindness to someone who you might not know everything about. Take your tray and sit by somebody you normally wouldn't. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, now a few closing words. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Ms. Straß, for the wonderful moderation of this event. And thank you, Tom Franklin, for being so honest with us, sharing your story and enlightening us even. And dear students and teachers, thank you as well for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the last 90 minutes and that you can benefit from it. If you've missed part of today's event, do not worry, we got you. You can watch the video on YouTube again and again, because we'll keep it online at least until your Abitur in a few months. And tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your students who couldn't make it today, so that they can get a chance and prepare for the Abitur in the best possible way. And if you like what we do and want to know more about the German-American Institutes, you can follow us on social media and or subscribe to our newsletters. And at this point, I also like to thank our cooperation partners, the Karl-Schurz-Haus in Freiburg, the D.a.z. in Stuttgart, and the d.a.i. in Heidelberg. You can find more information about them and what they offer for you, students and teachers, below this video. And what's left to say, thank you all for watching, and I wish you all the best for your Abitur. Bye-bye.